Evening. The Tuesday, April 11th, Finance and Planning Committee of the Regional Transportation District here in Denver will now come to order. We are convened as of 5:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and I would respectfully ask everyone who is attending this meeting, please to mute yourself until you are actually formally recognized to speak. We want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and we please ask you to note that the committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors are continuing to be held remotely via Zoom for at least the next several months. These meetings will be audio and video recorded. The recordings of these meetings, along with the unofficial minutes of the meetings themselves, will be posted as soon as is reasonably practicable on the board's website. Please feel free to visit rtd-denver.com to find those. And there's also a live stream of this meeting that is available for you on RTD's YouTube channel. So you may feel free to use that as well. Directors and members of staff, please, for the sake of the record, if you would like to be acknowledged to speak during tonight's proceedings, I would ask you please to raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call upon you before proceeding to speak so that we may make a comprehensible record. And directors and staff who are participating by phone can also raise their virtual hands to indicate that they would like to speak by pressing *9 on your phone. And to toggle your mute setting on the phone, you simply have to press *6. So I will now call the roll for the committee members. Director Peggy Catlin.
Here.
Thank you. And Director Bobby Deschel.
Here.
And Chair Lynn Geisinger.
Here.
And Director Ian Harwick.
Here.
And Director Michael Guzman. We'll ask again, Director Guzman, are you present? And we will acknowledge him if he joins the meeting later. Director and Vice Chair of this committee, Eric Davidson.
Here.
And I am Doug Tisdale and serve as Chair of the Finance and Planning Committee, and I am present. And for the sake of the record, I will indicate whom I see, and I'll ask for others to supplement. I see that Director Bob Broom is with us here this evening, and the record should so reflect. And Director Marjorie Sloan is with us here this evening. Director Kate Williams is here with us this evening, and Director Troy Whitmore is also present with us this evening. Are there any other board member? Oh, I see, I'm sorry. Director Joyanne Rusha, I also see is present with us here this evening. Are there any other board members who are present that I have not acknowledged? Hearing none, I take it that I have acknowledged everyone who is present for this meeting, and that means that we now proceed to the public comment. And I note that Director Guzman has now joined us. So Director Michael Guzman, your presence as a committee member is acknowledged and recorded. We now proceed to the public comment section of this meeting. And I will open up the public comment for anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic that is listed in the published meeting agenda for this current month or for the immediately preceding month. So if you would wish to speak to us and you haven't already done this, please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone, and staff will unmute you when it is your turn to speak. If you're dialed in, also remember, press *6 in order to toggle your mute settings. Before we acknowledge people, let's please bear in mind that by participating in this process, you are being recorded and you give your consent thereto. If you do not wish to be recorded, then your comments will need to be submitted to us in writing. And comments can always be submitted to the board office at this email address, which is rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. Now, during public comment, please note that the committee will not be offering comments or responses. Directors or staff may contact speakers following their comments if they raise matters that lend themselves to some sort of follow-up. And speakers should please begin their remarks by stating your name, and each speaker will have up to 3 minutes to speak. Now, I see no hands raised from anyone on the Zoom call itself. Let me then ask staff, is there anyone who has raised their hand by way of connection on the telephone?
There are no hands raised.
Seeing no hands raised, we have no one who has asked to speak out loud at this meeting. Let me then ask our board office staff, were any email comments received for this meeting of the Finance and Planning Committee?
No, there were no emails.
All right. So with no participants in the queue and no email comments received, we will close the public comment portion of this meeting at this time. Our next item on the agenda is information from external entities, and there is one external entity report on the agenda this evening, and it is one that we always look forward to when we have the pleasure of the company of the CU Leeds School of Business with us. And so regarding the sales and use tax forecast, I would now like to ask Doug McLeod, the Chief Financial Officer of the RTD, and those representatives from the University of Colorado Leeds School of Business to present their sales and use tax forecast. Mr. McLeod, I will acknowledge you first so that you may then also introduce the team from the CU Leeds School.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening to the committee members as well as other board members. This is a semi-annual forecast that CU Leeds School of Business Research Division prepares for RTD. RTD contracts with the Business Research Division to get independent economic consulting services not readily available in-house. This comes before this committee twice a year. The forecast is used for, sales and use tax forecast is used for not only our budget, our annual budget, but also our midterm financial plan and our long-range forecasting. As this body is aware, our sales and use taxes for RTD make up approximately 2/3 of total revenues. So it's a very important source of funding for this agency. The package itself includes the full forecast in addition to these presentation materials. So if you're interested in reading the full forecast with commentary, it is available publicly. And my final comment is to mention that the presentation that you will see tonight has a few slight changes to some of the slides based on some additional information that was recently received, more current information, and the team will review those as they go through their presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speakers, Robert McNown, Richard Wobekind, Brian Lewandowski, and Adam Illig from the Business Research Division up at CU Leeds. So gentlemen, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right, so I'm sharing the screen. Are we seeing it?
Yes, we see it.
Great. So thank you so much for the introduction. And as always, thank you so much for working with us. We very much appreciate this. As mentioned by Doug, the names of our team are on the slide, and one of us is missing, but the other four are here to help answer questions. For the sake of time and knowing you have a long agenda, we're only two of us are speaking, and we hope to proceed through the slides in a rather a timely fashion, if you will. So that said, we are having trouble moving the slides forward. Okay. So you're well aware we've been involved with this. I'm not going to go into any detail. While there were a number of new board members when we presented last fall, now you're getting settled in, those of you who were relatively new at the time. I will highlight that we've been doing this for over 10 years, and the first four names on the initial slide were all in from the beginning. So we've had quite a long run and seen a lot of data and a lot of pieces of the economy as we've gone through the years. That said, you don't need to open up any news broadcast or newspaper or Wall Street Journal or Business Week to know that there have been a lot of mixed signals from the national economy. And of course, the national economy helps drive the state economy. The state economy helps drive the RTD model, something you'll hear more about from my colleague, Robert McNown, in just a short period of time. And so we've been tracking these things, and a lot of them, they literally are changing week to week. But when we had something in green, it was, optimism in terms of not going into a recessionary scenario. Something in yellow, it's sort of, going sideways at the moment. And then the items in red were clearly things that we felt were more signaling, trouble ahead, or, a definite headwind as opposed to a tailwind in the economy. And more recently, we have seen significant signs of slowdown. You may or may not recall, but when we came out with our annual forecast in the fall, or just in December, we talked about the fact we anticipated very slow GDP growth for this year. We got a little bit fooled by how strong the economy remained in November, December, and into the beginning of January. But now the economy seems to be settling into this pattern of a much slower growth for the current year, for 2023. GDP growth of under 1%. So the first quarter's GDP, which is in the books but not announced to us yet, be coming up in a few weeks. The first quarter GDP number is probably going to be something around 1.7%. But then the next three quarters are a lot more tenuous. Second quarter growth probably going to be really slow, like less than 0.5%, somewhere in that range. Potential for the third quarter GDP growth to be negative, and then the fourth quarter GDP growth to be only slightly positive. So all by way of saying that the scenarios we're running to do these forecasts are really anticipating a very slow year. We talked about it as potentially a slow session, no recession technically, but a very, very slow growth for the year. When we look at employment, you've heard many times that U.S. employment and Colorado employment have preceded the February 2020 COVID peak. Of course, that's good news as a general statement. But if you look at the red line on the slide, what I'm really trying to highlight here is that had we stayed on the previous trend, that the U.S. economy would have at least 2 million more jobs than we have right now. So, while it's good or decent job growth, it certainly is indicating, we haven't gotten back to, if you will, potential sort of job growth, if you want to think of it in that fashion. And of course, one of the things that's been hampering us has been the inflationary environment. You can see on this particular slide, and again, you have all of these in your packet, the comparison between the US city average, that's overall US, the mountain region, which Colorado is part of, and Denver, Aurora, Lakewood. And we're going to have new numbers on this at the end of this week. There's a little bit of not positive anticipation out there at this point. There are some people who think we're going to see inflation potentially at the national level tick up a little bit, and that might, in fact, impact future monetary policy, or being more specific, lock in the next rate increase of 25 basis points. I think some people are hoping the Fed might hold at this point in time, but if inflation runs a little hot on Friday, I think we're going to be looking at a scenario that would be likely see another rate increase. One thing that has happened in the last several months as new data has come in is our rank amongst other states has fallen in a number of categories. This is a little bit, I don't know, complicated is the word a lot of people like to use. But in the third quarter of last year, when we had the third quarter data for Colorado, we had some very impressive numbers in personal income and personal income growth. And that, as it turns out, when we look at the data more carefully, was really brought about to some extent from the Tabor tax refunds that we all received during that, or many of us received during that quarter. So that bumped up our personal income growth, and we went from being the number one state in the country for transfer payments in the third quarter of 2022 to the lowest. We were ranked 50th, I should say, in personal income transfers in the fourth quarter. So that particular piece really impacted us a little bit in terms of our personal income growth. And you can see from being a top 5 personal income growth state, we've dropped down now into the 20s. We've also seen a slowing in our employment growth. If you see the second number down on this slide, 1.6% year over year ranks the state 46th. Now, again, just, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just in context, so people aren't jumping off the bridge here. We were, we had very rapid growth, and we had one of the earliest recoveries out of the COVID recession. We were a top 10, top 15 state. So cooling a little bit sooner than some of the other states, I don't think makes things dramatically bad. We're still talking about a healthy growth rate for this year, particularly compared to the national economy. We look at a couple of very positive indicators. Labor force, we're currently 81,000 higher from the previous peak, the COVID peak, and that's a 2.6% growth in the labor force. And while we're no longer the sort of second highest labor force participation state, I should have highlighted this on the last slide, we're still one of the highest labor force participation states in the country. So that's good news. And on the right-hand side, you see a statistic that's oftentimes quoted at the national level. It's called the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or the JOLTS survey. And you can see the incredible gap that came about after the recovery from the COVID recession, with way more job openings than we have unemployed people in the economy. The most recent data, that gap is closing a little bit, both nationally and in the state, but we're still talking about approximately 1.8 jobs available for every one unemployed person. So the opportunities are still very strong. And all of that leads to having, very solid, if you will, unemployment rates, both in the state and nationally, but you would consider to be a healthy employment market. The state level number is at 3.2%. And just to provide a little bit of color for the commissioners and the staff, provided this slide to just give you a sense of the counties that are represented in the RTD district, how they're doing. and a couple of them have higher unemployment rates than the state, but most don't. And the numbers are still, generally speaking, pretty modest numbers. So we're feeling pretty good, and this is through February, so very recent data that we updated this slide with. And then the other thing we're seeing is a definite slowing in terms of national and retail sales. Still a very healthy growth rate year over year through February. This is the February number that we have for the nation is at 5.4%, but it did decline in February. So we are starting to see the slowdown of the national economy and the slowdown in the employment, and frankly, the higher impact of the higher interest rates starting to slow the momentum in terms of retail sales and in terms of overall GDP growth. This is an updated slide through January. The one in your packet was through December, and I only highlight that because you can see year over year, the state is now down to 6.6% growth. That's the green dotted line year over year in terms of taxable retail sales. And you can see that there are now an increasing number of counties that year over year have a negative sales tax growth on the right-hand side. Fortunately, none of the RTD district counties are in that category. Everybody in yellow is, in positive territory, at least through January. But this sort of gives you a sense of the slowing nature, if you will. And Robert will talk more about this shortly, but that was built into the forecast that you have and that we provided back, in time. So we'll have more discussion of that. With that, I'm passing this baton on to my colleague, Robert McNown, and he's going to take you through the slides are built around the RTD forecast. Take it away, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. Rich has laid out the national context very effectively, and it's the national economy that, at least in part, drives our model of the Colorado economy. So we'll spend a little bit glancing at what the current forecasts look like. We take our forecasts from Moody's, and I'll talk a little bit more later about the alternative scenarios that Moody's provides. But according to the baseline scenario, which we're emphasizing in our forecast, you can see that for 2023, highlighted in red here, these indicators are substantially weaker, considerably weaker than they were in 2022. The one exception being personal income. And personal income is a bit of an anomaly because it includes not just wage and salary growth, but also transfer payments and investment income and so on. So, but look, for example, particularly at retail sales, which is really crucial in our model for driving sales tax revenues. And you can see in 2022 that retail sales grew by over 9%. And now for 2023, Moody's is projecting only a 2.2% growth in retail sales. Let's go to the next slide, Rich. And so the core of our forecasting model is a model of the Colorado economy. And so let's see what the key indicators look like there for the current year, for 2023. And again, you see the same thing, particularly noting on retail sales, how much lower we expect retail sales to be for 2023 compared to last year. And also compare that 4.6% projected growth in retail sales with the rate of inflation in the front range at 4.3%. So there's really no real increase in retail in sales expenditures here. That basically consumers are expected to sort of maintain their current standard of living by simply spending more to keep up with the increasing price level. And the other thing that looks considerably slower is the growth in employment, which, as Rich pointed out, was surprisingly strong in 2022. Let's go on to the next one. So here we get to the sales and use tax revenues, which is, of course, the ultimate output from our model. We forecast a number of separate components of sales tax revenues because, as we noticed over the pandemic and in the aftermath, that these different components were moving in different directions altogether. As you well know, we had, for example, grocery store sales really strong, restaurant sales really grim. And then the reverse somewhat, although grocery stores sales have maintained pretty good strength coming out of the pandemic as well. So at any rate, from comparing last year, where we had 13% growth in RTD sales and use tax revenues in 2022, our projection now is only close to 4% growth for the current year, a little bit stronger in 2024. Okay, Rich, next one. Now, of course, we're always revising our forecasts as we get more data. And here you can see, for example, that some surprising strength, as Rich mentioned, in late 2022 has increased sales and use tax revenues to a higher level than we were anticipating, even though our forecasted rate of growth was pretty strong, but not as strong as actually materialized. And so you can see then that the current projections are now going out to our medium-term horizon out to 2029, that the current forecast, although these three forecasts from currently and the previous ones seem to follow pretty much the same trend, but at a higher plateau, a higher level here in the current forecast labeled by March 2023. The next slide. So we realize that any forecast is going to be vulnerable to some unanticipated events, and so there's always uncertainty in the forecast. And so we try to capture that in several ways. One is that we generate statistically based forecast bounds, and those are labeled here by the high forecast and the low forecast, and they represent basically there's only a 33% chance that the actual outcome could be higher than the high forecast or lower than the low forecast. And then at the same time, we rely on alternative scenarios from Moody's. And those are labeled here by the optimistic and the pessimistic. And the baseline, which is the one that we emphasize, but of course, it's always prudent to keep one's eye on the possible outcomes. The pessimistic and optimistic scenarios from Moody's reflect their alternative assumptions they might make about some of these headwinds that may or may not materialize. And the next slide. So in addition to the short run and medium run forecasts that we've been looking at here, we're also charged with developing a long run forecast, and that's what you see here. And our model of the long run revenue forecast depends heavily on demographic changes, the slowing of the population growth and the aging of the population. And both of those factors are going to have depressive effects on economic growth. And you can see that, just take any one of those columns in the table there. So RTD taxable sales, for example, averaging annual growth in the current decade of over 6%, but dropping quite dramatically in the following 2 decades. And overall, then expecting growth in taxable sales and therefore tax revenues of about 3 1/3%, averaged over all 3 of those decades. And next slide. So I just want to emphasize the basis behind our forecast. The forecast is model based. We We don't use add factors that other forecasters do and try to make subjective adjustments to what the model tells us. We think the model makes the best use of available data. We try to bring to bear the most current economic data in the forecast. And as in previous slides, I really emphasized that there is certainly uncertainty about the forecasts, and we want to present that in a transparent way. And finally, we don't have any particular financial stake in the forecast numbers, but we want them to be as accurate and useful to the staff and the board of RTD. So we'd be happy to take any questions, and our other colleagues, Brian and Adam, are available as well.
Thank you, Robert. We appreciate that. And this is the opportunity now for the committee members and the other directors present. If you have a question that you would like to pose to our financial experts, and they truly are experts in this field, please raise your hand and you will be acknowledged in turn. And the first director who has raised a hand here is Director Broom. Director Broom, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair. The major wildfires that took place in Colorado is going to cause insurance companies to spend a lot of money rebuilding. Has that been factored into our model?
Well, our model does include measures of building permits, and it's so to some extent, yes, the increased building activity, and of course, being here in Boulder, I've certainly seen the impact of the Marshall Fire and all the rebuilding that's going on there. It's and of course the picture there, the result of that is quite mixed. On the one hand, the construction activity that's taking place in that area is increase in construction jobs and building materials, and that in turn is going to lead to some increase in tax revenues. So through building permits, we are capturing some of those effects. Now, of course, we're not in a position to anticipate future fires or any other sort of environmental catastrophes. So that's one of those unpredictables that where you want some sort of margin of error in the forecast confidence bounds.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, has the district been contacted about foregoing the 1% tax on building materials in those fire areas?
Mr. Chair, this is Doug McLeod. I can answer that question. So thank you for the question, Director Broom. So the bill is being considered still in the House. As this body is aware, RTD follows the same exemptions as the state. The proposed bill would exempt certain use taxes associated with the Marshall Fire rebuilding should it pass. So assuming that did pass, RTD would be subject to that exemption. The way that we've looked at it in discussing this with General Manager and CEO Deborah Johnson is that it's kind of foregone revenue. It's not necessarily a decrease. It would be additional use taxes that would have been generated supposing this bill does not pass, that RTD was not anticipating. The state provided an estimated fiscal impact of those use taxes lost under this bill potentially for RTD, and their estimate is between 1.1 million and 2.2 million during fiscal year 23-24, and then 0.8 million to 1.5 million the following fiscal year is the estimated impact from the Marshall Fire rebuilding should those taxes not be collected.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Broom. And I take it what I'm hearing on that too is relative to the 1%. There will be increased construction associated with rebuilding following the fire. There will be a little less use tax collected should the bill pass. But the increase in construction might pretty much be balanced out with those two factors. So that might work. All right, Director Broom, anything further from you, sir?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Whitmore, you are recognized now, sir.
Thank you, Chair, but I certainly would yield to committee members and their questions first in the essence of time if Director Deschel would like to proceed. No? Okay. All right. Thank you, though. Just back a couple slides. Help me, gentlemen. I was real curious about the sales tax revenue. Yes, there it is. Or Colorado retail sales. What's the thinking on those huge declines in decades out? Certainly, probably long after I'm gone. But I'm just curious what drives that. It's just such a huge change.
Yeah, it really is a major difference between the current decade and what we're expecting in the future. And this is very much a demographically driven forecast that when we, up until now, our country and our economy has experienced somewhat of a demographic dividend as we've had a huge growth in the labor force. Now, that growth has disappeared with the aging of the baby boomers, and so we see that kind of demographic change is having current and even future implications for economic growth. That in order to fund the retirement and Medicare, for example, for this growing elderly population, that's going to put more of a burden on the working age population at the same time that the share of the population that is of working age is shrinking. And so those factors are sort of a direct way of understanding only one of the several ways in which the demographic change is having adverse implications for the future economy and future economic growth. And then simply the slowing of total population is also contributing to the slowing of economic growth in those later decades.
Okay, excellent answer.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I was just
couple
going to,
observations. First of all, it really, sorry, Mr. Chair, but it really speaks to our need for diversity of income as we move into the next phases of RTD. And secondly, I kind of resemble some of those remarks, Robert. I'm a shopper and I'll be gone in those decades. They're going to miss me and all my friends.
Right.
Right.
Thank you, Mr.
well,
Chair.
Thank you,
we
Director
age-
Whitmore. And Rich, you wanted to add something there?
I just wanted to, just embellish Robert's comments. As we age, we buy a lot less goods and a lot more services. So that aging part, to go to what you said, Commissioner Whitmore, it does really impact the retail sales piece.
And if I can just go back for a second before recognizing Director Deschel here, I had a question about packet page 52. It's not on your slides, but for those directors who have access to their packet, it's your figure 27, and it's the Colorado value of construction. And you do reflect that 2021 and 22 were pretty robust at about 824 billion. I'm sorry, 24 billion. It would have been nice if it was 824. 24 billion, and you're looking at about 22 billion for 2023. And that kind of begs the question back to Director Broom. That's anticipating the remedial and restorative construction associated with the fires. Is that correct?
Well, I'm sure that's a piece of it, but in addition, it's reflecting more macroeconomic trends that the restrictive monetary policies that the Fed has been pursuing over the last year or so higher interest rates and of course increasing the cost of borrowing. And that's ultimately having a negative impact on the construction, whether it's single family, multifamily, even other types of non-housing building activity.
Thank you. I appreciate that supplement, and I apologize for diverting from Director Deschel, whom I recognize now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and no worries. Thank you all for the great presentation. I apologize if I missed this, but did I hear you all correctly that you do not take climate risk and climate resilience into your analysis?
Well, certainly the Moody's projections, which drive to some extent our Colorado economy model, are going to incorporate their best projections of what is going to be happening in terms of, let's say, adapting to climate change or restructuring the economy away from fossil fuels reliance and more on cleaner forms of energy. All those sorts of changes are going to be costly in some sense. And I'm sure that Moody's takes those into account in their long-run projections of, let's say, productivity growth or output per worker. But in terms of an unanticipated specific climatological event, well, we only take that into account in the sense of recognizing the uncertainty in our forecasts and representing that uncertainty through those alternative bounds, the alternative forecasts that take into account either alternative national scenarios or simply a statistical measure of the uncertainty in the forecasts themselves. So all those sorts of events that we really can't anticipate are going to show up in those confidence bands that surround the baseline forecast.
Yeah, I would push back on that a little bit, given that real estate institutional investment uses climate risk and climate risk resilience in their underwriting today when making lending and investment decisions in debt and capital markets. And so it's a little surprising and frankly concerning to hear that given use tax and sales tax are such big components, that your response is, well, no, we just rely on Moody's and hope it incorporates these, recognizing that the 100-year floodplain, the 50-year floodplain, those FEMA maps, these are known knowns. We know them within our district. And so I guess I'll ask it slightly differently. Why haven't you adjusted your methodology to incorporate what is emerging in institutional and major debt markets as a key underwriting item and a key risk, knowing that that's going to have an impact on our sales and use tax?
Well, I mentioned that there are two ways in which we're incorporating these sort of future climatological events or adaptation to climate change. One of them was relying to some extent on what Moody's is assuming and how that's going to affect productivity. But the other, which you didn't seem to take to heart, was that when we present these bounds on the forecast, where we've got a high forecast and a low forecast, well, you can see that in the slide that's up here right now. So that low forecast then, for example, would take into account the possibility of environmental disasters. We can't tell you when they're going to happen. We can't tell you if they're going to happen, but you're most likely correct that over the 30-year period that we're looking at into the future here in this long-run forecast, there are going to be some major shocks to the environment with implications for the economy. And so that's the way in which we accommodate the sort of risk analysis that I think I agree with you is very important and useful for the staff and for the directors of RTD. That if you feel that even with these sort of pessimistic low rates of growth that you're seeing here in the table going out into the future, if you think those are still too optimistic, well, that's why there's that lower bound forecast that you can emphasize, or maybe some intermediate compromise rate of growth.
And does your model take into account state legislative policy changes and those projections? So theoretically, right, the state set pretty aggressive energy goals, which is going to transition theoretically us a bit over to more and more electric vehicles and fewer fossil fuel vehicles. And the state's workaround to this was to add these as a fee as opposed to a tax. Is that also just sort of in the bucket of low forecast?
Yes, I would have to say so. I mean, I don't have a specific part of the model that takes into account specific economic policies that the state government might adopt. That's the model just simply is not that detailed.
Okay. Is there a reason why, right? If we're retaining CU to be our economic forecaster, and we're here in this metro area, and we're all in the same area, is there a reason we're not? And I apologize if I missed this, but to me, the advantage of hiring the premier public institution who's also in the district would be to apply that local knowledge and to apply those state regulatory changes. Is there a reason that CU is not including that in this?
Can my colleagues help me out here?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it may be helpful, Director, if we have a follow-up conversation on that. So when we think about what's taxable within the district, the vehicle tax, for instance, and maybe there's something I'm not familiar with in some of these rules that are coming out. So the gas tax is something that I don't believe RTD is benefiting from, but vehicle sales are. So as we've looked at vehicle sales in detail, whether it's a fossil fuel vehicle or an EV, we are taking a look at the value of those vehicles that are sold over time. So I guess that the model is a little agnostic to it being an EV or a fossil vehicle, because we're taking a look at the volume of vehicles and the value of vehicles sold over time. And we're picking that up in the district, and we're taking a look at historical sales within the district. And we're also seeing that transition to EVs historically, and in the Moody's forecast, we're seeing greater and greater adoption of EVs. So that's in there. So help me out. The particular law that you're referencing, is that a change in the tax on EV sales and use taxes?
It's a specific change in that you're no longer going to a gas station, at which we know that gas stations derive the vast majority of their profits from point of sale inside that area, right? And so these policy changes have, and we can connect offline about it. It was a little discouraging to hear sort of one right after the other that maybe you guys are, and I'm just not picking it up correctly, but that these specific hyper-local issues, which are going to impact the way we live our lives and the way in which tax is collected and assessed, may not be in the model. And that's a little concerning for me as a director. And it could just be that I'm not fully understanding the model. So maybe we can find some time to connect.
Yeah, please. And one of my difficulties thinking about climate change is so some of the historical models had population change, net migration from the coasts into some of the interior states like Colorado. But perhaps Colorado won't be the best place to migrate to in the future. And, there's suggestions that maybe Colorado is a flyover state and people move to the upper Midwest where water is a little bit more abundant. So
that's one thing we've thought about. Another thing is sort of the perverse reaction with regard to sales and use taxes. And I think that, you know, this was brought up well earlier with regard to the Marshall Fire. So there's the destruction of a lot of property, but you know, the jurisdictions are sort of rewarded for that in a way when we destroy and rebuild, because all of the goods that are purchased to rebuild homes and businesses then are taxed. And then that led to this question about, well, is there some sort of tax abatement for people who are rebuilding from a natural disaster? And I don't know what the future legislation will be on that. But, you know, is there a case where we just don't rebuild in some of those areas because of the change in the floodplains and changes to rules where we build in the mountains? And so I think that there's sort of uncertainty on both sides. It could lead to the low forecast line, as Robert was suggesting, if there's sort of a negative adverse effect, or if we're just going through this process of rebuilding after a natural disaster, and a lot of that ends up being taxable. Could the perverse impact actually be an increase in sales and use taxes in some of these areas? And so that's part of my struggle, but I would love to hear more from you about this.
Yeah, I'll send you a note. We'll find some time.
Thanks.
I know
Thank
Director
you.
Bill wants to keep this tight.
I appreciate that. No, that's fine. And I think just in further response, some of the projections you're talking about and considerations that developers take into account for their long-term plans and capital costs associated with construction are not as linked to sales and use tax. And the task of the CU Leeds School of Business is to address sales and use tax. And some of the factors that you've addressed, such as climate change, do not directly manifest themselves in sales and use tax, as I understand it. I don't pretend to be an expert. I think it's good discussion. I think we can follow up further on that. Director Williams, let me go to you. You've been patient.
Thank you, Chair. I just need to make a comment from my platform for older adults, which is the fastest growing population in the state of Colorado. And hopefully all of you at this meeting will enter that category as opposed to the alternative. And in fact, in my experience, and in a lot of the studies that are coming out, older adults are outspending the younger groups because they have disposable income and because they are downsizing and using that money. So I would, on top of which, I think as older adults begin using public transportation, once it becomes again, respect the ride and safe, they are more liable to give up their driver's license and drive and ride driver's license and stop driving and ride public transportation. So I just don't want to see us disregard the influence of older adults in terms of ridership, in terms of finance, or in terms of support.
Thank you for that observation. And we will definitely be talking more about the age advantage community. But Robert, I'm sorry, were you going to add something there?
Richard.
Richard, yes.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Tisdale. I couldn't agree more, but the point I was trying to make earlier was that we are better resourced and than younger people are in many cases. We're spending more of our money on medical and travel, and going back to one of the other commissioners' comments earlier on, when you're thinking about diversity of resources over the longer haul, tying it all to goods in terms of sales tax probably doesn't play well as the population ages. So thinking about that, I don't know what specifically RTD could think about, but I think it is something worth thinking about.
Chair, one more quickie. When we're looking at diversity in older adults, we need to realize that we do in fact provide a service to older adults and people with disabilities through our Access a Ride program, which is an extremely expensive program, and ridership is continuing to rise. So that's something that we need to be aware of now, but out. Thank you, Chair Tisdale.
Thank you very much, Director Williams. Are there other directors who have questions for CU? Vice Chair Davidson, please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Always great, always helpful, especially seeing the near-term impact and forecast, which have been very helpful. Everyone knows what I'm going to say. It looks like we need to finish this decade with some other ideas of alternative funding models. So thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Another preview of other matters this evening. Okay, thank you. All right. Are there any further comments from our guests from the CU Lead School of Business that you would like to finish out with at this time?
Well,
Richard
as
or
always,
Robert?
we'd like to thank the staff, Commissioner Tisdale. They're very easy to work with, and we very much appreciate the support.
Thank you, sir. And we
I'll
appreciate
add-
yours.
Thank
And
you.
Robert, yep, thank
Yeah,
you.
I'll add, we appreciate the discussion that we had this evening with the members of the board, and I certainly take your comments to heart. And if it's feasible for us to improve our modeling and forecasting along the lines that have been discussed this evening, we'll certainly try to pursue that.
All right, thank you. Well, we appreciate that. CU has always been very responsive to the needs of the RTD. Thank you. All right, with that, we conclude our section of the meeting regarding reports and information from external entities, and we thank all of the representatives of the CU Lead School of Business for their participation this evening. Our next portion of the agenda relates to recommended actions. There are no recommended actions on the agenda this evening, but you're not getting out that easily, folks. We now have some discussion items for you. There are 2 discussion items on the agenda this evening. And the first item is the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study Update. And so at this time, I would respectfully ask Henry Stoppelkamp, our Assistant General Manager of Capital Programs, and Patrick Stanley, the Manager of Engineering Programs, and Jeet Desai, the Manager of Engineering Construction, and Carl Green Jr., our Director of Civil Rights, to present this item. In the first instance, I will call upon Henry Stoppelkamp. If now I don't see you on the screen, Henry, are you? Oh, there you are. All right, thank you. Henry, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Board of Directors. My team made up of the individuals she just mentioned, and I will be giving an update on the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study. It's in the board packet starting on page 79. There's a 3-page summary in there, and then it slides into the PowerPoint on page 83. Just as a reminder, the study is to gather a common set of facts to determine the impacts and the requirements to provide Northwest Rail Corridor with 3 trains from Longmont to Denver Union Station in the morning and 3 trains from Denver Union Station to Longmont in the evening. So with that, I will turn it over to the team. They will go through the project and give everybody an update of where we are. We're about 1 year into the study, and we felt it was time to come back to the board. So with that, I will turn it over to our project manager, Patrick Stanley. Take it away, Patrick.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Mr. Chair and directors. Can everybody see the presentation okay? Okay, we will get rolling here. Once again, my name is Patrick Stanley. I am the Manager of Engineering Programs at RTD. I serve as the project manager for the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study. Presenting with me today is Jeet Desai, Business Program Manager, Capital Programs, and Carl Green Jr., Director of Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Division. I thank you for the opportunity to present an update on the study and the initial public input we received from our first round of public open houses. The following presentation starts on page 83 of your board packet if you wish to follow along in that manner. Let me get this. Okay, there. So in today's project update, we will provide an overview of the Northwest Rail and peak service feasibility concept. We'll provide a summary of community outreach and input efforts. We'll also provide environmental justice and equity effort update, and we'll provide a quick look at the upcoming next steps for the study. So I'd like to start with a quick overview and refresher about the Northwest Rail. The Northwest Rail was included as part of the Fast Tracks program that was approved by voters in 2004. In total, the rail line would include 42 miles of rail service from Denver Union Station to Longmont. A little over 6 miles of the corridor known as the B line was completed in 2016 as part of the Eagle P3 project. The B line is an overhead electrified segment that operates on RTD dedicated and controlled track, which terminates at the existing Westminster Station near 72nd and Lowell. The remaining 35 miles would operate on the existing BNSF track from Westminster Station to Longmont. So following the passage of the Fast Tracks program, an environmental evaluation was completed in 2010 that looked at full service scenario, which included 55 round trips per day, full double tracking of the entire corridor, and 11 stations. But due to a lack of dedicated funding source at that time, the project was not able to be implemented at that particular time. So in 2013, RTD conducted the Northwest Area Mobility Study, or NAMS. The NAMS looked at phasing for the full service scenario really by segments. But after careful consideration, RTD, along with the Northwest area stakeholders, determined the Northwest Rail to be a longer term goal, with RTD committing to further exploration and providing periodic updates. In 2017, the concept of an initial peak service was proposed by the Northwest area stakeholders. From that time until 2021, the RTD staff and stakeholder partners worked to refine the peak service concept. In addition to that, the RTD re-engaged with the BNSF to discuss the feasibility of a peak service program. The study is assessing the feasibility, as Henry mentioned, of an initial peak period service, which consists of 3 weekday morning trips from Longmont to Denver and 3 weekday evening trips from Denver back to Longmont. We are partnering with local jurisdictions to plan 6 new stations on the extended portion of the corridor. Additionally, we are looking at feasible locations for a maintenance facility in Longmont, since the vehicle technology of the Northwest Rail would differ from our current commuter rail fleet. The study is looking at potential train types and technologies that meet our operational needs and requirements. Throughout the study, we are exploring opportunities for potential partnerships, including the Front Range passenger rail. So as I mentioned earlier, peak service would include 6 new stations along the extended 35-mile segment. Starting from the south, these stations are downtown Westminster, Broomfield 116th, Flatiron, downtown Louisville, Boulder Junction at Depot Square, and downtown Longmont. So while we're leading the study, we're not doing this alone. We're working through a collaborative effort between RTD, local transportation partners, BNSF Railway, CDOT, and Front Range Passenger Rail District. The organizations you see listed on this slide make up our study advisory team, or what we refer to as the SAT, for the project, and help to provide input and feedback throughout the process. Collectively, we aim to provide a safe, reliable, and connected multimodal transportation network in the Northwest area. We would like to point out potential benefits of peak service that may make it a more feasible option. Peak service would require fewer infrastructure and operational needs, and given limited resources, could allow a rail service on the corridor sooner rather than later. The concept prevents a more cost-effective approach to begin initial train service while pursuing funding for future all-day service. A peak service would accomplish track and safety upgrades, which would lay the foundation for all-day service. And peak service has a proven track record in other urban areas as a starter service that can expand with as ridership demand grows. And then finally, peak service could address some of the ridership needs of today that could be built upon as demand grows. There is no determined start date for rail service to begin. The purpose of this study, as Henry mentioned, is to explore the feasibility of a peak service operation by determining what track improvements and infrastructure is needed to operate a peak service on the corridor. We are working to identify what we refer to as a common set facts, including design, construction, and operations cost, ridership, benefits and impacts, and potential strategic partnerships. The study is broken up into a 5-milestone process with the work continuing until the end of this year. Milestones 1 and 2 were fact-finding efforts associated with the definition of the peak service concept and discovery of existing conditions throughout the corridor. Obviously, many things have changed since the 2010 environmental evaluation. We are currently in milestone 3, which is represented by this vertical blue line on the slide that you see here. And we are working to define the initial base configuration of peak service. So moving forward into milestones 4 and 5, the study will examine opportunities to refine the peak service base configuration and identify potential partnerships and funding sources and define options, strategies, and possible next steps. As you can see here, we had our first public engagement earlier this year at the end of January and early February, which is right here on this image. And at this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Mr. Jeet Desai, who will provide an update on community outreach and input efforts. Jeet, it's all yours.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Mr. Chairs and Director, for your time this evening. I'm Jeet Desai, Manager of Engineering Construction with Capital Programs, and I'm excited to be here. The study team held 2 in-person public houses. The first one was held on 31st in Boulder, and the next one was on February 2nd in Westminster. The total attendance for these 2 events combined was 195 participants. We collectively received 29 comment cards and at the event, and also provided QR codes for participants to visit our online meetings. The online meeting ran for 3 weeks from January 31st to February 21st. The online meeting received over 3,000 total views and generated 173 completed surveys. Additionally, over 350 comments and email signups occurred on RTD webpage. Following the open houses, RTD and Northwest Rail study advisory team members met to debrief and capture common sentiments that emerged from the public events. Overall, the impression was positive, with a bit of cautious optimism. We heard from several people that although the peak service scenario may not work for them now, but they support the study as a starter service because that can expand later as the demand grows. There were also concerns expressed that range from potential reverse commute challenges, additional station locations, particularly at Niwot and Gun Barrel, and service to customers with non-traditional commuting times, that is, people working in hospitality and service industries. The team also heard feedback about potential partnerships with FRPR and BNSF and what those might look like. There were a number of questions about the difference between Northwest Rail full built and peak service operations. The questions were focused on ridership, cost, and schedule deltas. Our responses were more focused on peak period operations. We also heard questions about growth occurring around the stations, future developments, and the strains it can possibly cause on the existing infrastructure. Of course, one anticipated question was, what are the next steps if peak service is deemed infeasible. The project team's response was more leaning towards building more collaborations and partnership for exploring more feasibility options. We analyzed the comments provided at the open houses and from the online meetings. Many of the themes we observed at the open houses were identical and also noted in the comments. The tone of the responses was positive, and the responders urged the team to explore possible partnership with Northwest Rail implementation. We observed positive feedbacks from attendees who are new to the area and are not familiar with the Northwest Rail study, and also from the attendees who have lived in prior locations that have robust rail transit services. There is a continued interest in station location and additional station sites. People have expressed concerns about the peak service scenario, how well the existing RTD and local transportation systems will integrate with the Northwest Rail peak service project, and the potential bus service reductions with implementing the peak service plan. Attendees and responders appear to be excited and curious about the potential land use and development opportunities around the station areas. Questions were raised about the kind of development anticipated. Some attendees did also express concerns about the possibility of existing residents being pushed out because of the new development. And finally, there were a number of questions about the impacts of construction activities. Although at this point, this is not an immediate concern, but would need to be addressed in the future should the project move forward. One of the questions in the survey was how the service might not meet the needs of potential customers. It is important to note that survey responders selected more than one category as a response. Most survey responders expressed concerns about limited operating frequency, that is, no weekend or no midday or no evening service for non-traditional commuting patterns. Some survey responders felt that the proposed routes missed the key destinations. The survey also focused on the benefits of peak service plan. It was very encouraging to see all of the categories were pretty even, which even shows that the service could provide a wide range of benefit across the board. The survey responders expressed support for the study, and if implemented, they feel they will have more mobility solutions, will have stress-free commute, a safer way to travel, and reduce transportation cost. For the maintenance facility, the survey asks what factors are the most important to consider when evaluating a potential site. I would like to note that most people who responded to this question do not live in the immediate facility of the potential site. Nevertheless, most common factors are not surprising and are typical for this type of facility. Most survey responders expressed concerns about the train operation noise, air quality impact, traffic disruption, and a few were concerned about the visual impacts. At this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Carl Green Jr., who will provide an update on environmental justice and equity efforts. Take it away, Carl. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dee, and good evening, Mr. Chair and fellow board of directors. Again, my name is Carl Green Jr., Director of the Civil Rights Division. As both Henry and Patrick have alluded to, at this stage, we're working towards identifying what we call a common set of facts. An integral component to that is environmental justice and equity. And what I can say is that we are definitely leaning forward as it relates to compliance and the requirements as set forth by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the federal regulatory guidance as it relates to environmental justice and Title VI. Next slide. So what is environmental justice? Just to give a broad stroke overview, first bullet here, fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, which includes linguistically diverse populations and income. One highlight that I wanted to mention here, just as Jeet wonderfully stated, the overall stakeholder involvement plan and what feedback we received. I also wanted to highlight that as far as the environmental justice and equity component is ensuring that we're providing meaningful involvement. So working with the project management team and the consultants, we were able to leverage our community partners as well as community-based organizations to extend the reach to these historically underrepresented populations to ensure that they have this information, that they are invited and included in these open houses, as well as the ability to be able to partake in the survey responses. Next is focusing on equitable, whoops, previous slide, please.
Sorry.
Focusing on equitably sharing project benefits and preventing disproportionate impacts. This goes part and parcel with the overall project, ensuring that the equity scales are balanced. And then a focus here is on racial, minority, or low-income communities. If you look at the picture to the right, you can see the 6 proposed stations of this study, along with the overlay of the BIPOC or people of color, indicating that it is 35.4% people of color within this corridor. And we leverage this among other tools of being able to zero in to say, where do these populations are, where they live in specific neighborhoods. So we can leverage that to be able to do targeted outreach to these specific populations. And then lastly, environmental justice analysis is required for projects using federal funding. So the difference here is where you have for federal projects, environmental justice analysis, whereas with Title VI, it's both for federal and locally funded. Next slide. Now let's get into the environmental justice process. First, I just want to highlight the very bottom, why the EJ process matters. One is to ensure that historically underrepresented populations are involved in the planning and decision-making process. We are able to create a plan for how the benefits of the extended commuter rail service will be shared among the communities, as well as to address any potential negative impacts as it relates to the project, specifically for EJ populations. So if you then gravitate up to the top, when we're looking at the 4 stage of the process, from stage 1 is learning, 2 is identifying, 3 is mitigation, 4 is collaborating. We are inching towards the identifying stage. The current status is between learning and identifying, where we're getting a better understanding of the environmental justice communities, what are the perceived benefits or the potential benefits and negative effects. And then also, as we move along in this study, is being able to say, if there are any potential impacts, what are we going to do to minimize or avoid them? And then 4, again, a big piece of this is about collaboration. So documenting our process and being able to cultivate these relationships as it relates to the community partners for the future project. Next slide. So getting into the Northwest Rail Maintenance Facility, as Patrick mentioned earlier, we are looking at feasible locations for a maintenance facility in Longmont. And initially in the process, RTD identified 9 potential sites. We have distilled that down to 3 potential sites, which remain for further study. Specifically, why we chose this site, why we chose these 3 sites is because of the close proximity to the end of the line of downtown Longmont Station. If you look at the graphic to the left, you can see that Patrick is definitely doing the circle cursor. I appreciate that for context, where you can see the downtown Longmont proposed station. And then as you can see with the yellow, orange, and blue, where there's a potential site 2, site 8, and site 9. In addition to the close proximity, we want to ensure that it's bordering an existing rail track that can connect to the proposed Northwest rail line. And then lastly, needing to ensure that it's large enough for the rail maintenance facility with adequate space to support all-day rail service in the future. And one big bullet point that I wanted to highlight, or one thing that I wanted to emphasize, that is at this time, there are no approved plans to acquire property or construct the facility. Next slide. So really getting into the Title VI piece of it, in which I love about this project, where we're leaning forward with respect to equity. So although we're in the planning stage of this study, we have built into our work to conduct a preliminary Title VI facility siting equity analysis, which is a requirement by the FTA or the Federal Transit Administration, where if we are looking at facility location or a location of site, we are conducting analysis to compare the siting alternatives, and it must occur before the preferred site selection. And just to give you an overview of what the assessment includes, is we're looking at who would be potentially impacted by each of these different siting alternatives, specifically looking at EGA or Title VI population, BIPOC, and low income. 2 is whether or not there are any residents or businesses that require displacement displacement of those residents or businesses. 3rd is looking at the cumulative impacts from similar facilities that are in that particular area. So essentially, what is the cumulative or aggregated impacts of having a facility, a maintenance facility at that location? And then number 4, which is equally as important as this macro and micro level data assessment, is ensuring that we are bringing in input and conducting comprehensive outreach to persons that are potentially impacted by this facility siting. But as G stated earlier, within the potential sites, there are no residents close within a certain proximity of the actual site. So assess this is more of a cross-check to get a better understanding of what type of impacts by virtue of having a facility siting at that location. So with that being said, I'll now pass it back over to Patrick.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate that. Where do we go from here? From our current point in the study, right towards the end of milestone 3, we will continue to define and refine the initial footprint of the stations, freight sidings, and project infrastructure needs. We're analyzing the public input from the first public engagement touch points to determine how they might impact the peak service footprint. We will continue the ongoing efforts to compile and document the common set of facts. This is an effort that's really going to continue throughout the entirety of the study. And then the next public open houses are planned for late spring, early summer, to present more detailed information on the base configuration and updates on milestone 4 activities. So I'd like to thank all of you for board participation in the open houses and for your interest on the project. We are pleased being able to present this information to all of you tonight, and we look forward to being able to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate all of the information from all of our very talented and dedicated staff regarding this important study and the efforts that we are doing to push it forward. It represents a unique manifestation of communication, collaboration, and cooperation. And so it's good to see that. And that's what we're focused on tonight, is talking about this communication plan, this outreach plan, and what we're doing to carry this all forward and get further information. So let's entertain questions in that regard, and let's begin with Director Deschel. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One comment, one question, which is just confirming what I believe was reported to us earlier, which is thank you guys for getting out there and doing those outreach efforts. I have really grave concerns on the weight that 368 people might have on a multi-billion-dollar capital project, which I got to by adding 195 people in person plus 173 survey respondents, which assumes that each person only filled out the survey once, and none of the people who attended the in-person sessions also filled out a survey, which means that 368 number is likely high. That's really concerning. And again, every person's input is valid, but to me, that's a really low number for the price tag on this project. It's not a dig at any of the staff, but I think just something to keep in mind as we're looking at the comments we've received. The other is my understanding is that this would be a diesel train. And the second most popular benefit to this was reducing emissions. Is there a practically, if this moves forward, what does this look like? Does the asset exist that would run electric catenary overhead that then converts over to diesel at a new station? Or do we have to procure special cars? Do we have to take down the electric? Do we have to run electric all the way up? Help me understand that component of it, making sure that we're planning for facilities and for vehicles that actually exist and that we can take.
So who wants to respond? I see our General Manager, CEO, Deborah Johnson. You are recognized, ma'am. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity. And Director Deschel, thank you so much for your question. And I too would like to recognize staff's hard work and diligence on this feasibility study and bringing forward the comments in which they were able to garner through extensive outreach. So to the question that was posed by the director, specifically Director Deschel, as we go forward, I think it's important to recognize that we don't currently own the right of way. And so as we look to assessing the feasibility of bringing a project forward, those elements have yet to be considered. There's opportunities. Most of you know that I do sit on the Front Range Passenger Rail Board as an ex officio member. So when we look at interpassenger rail, there could be an opportunity as we go forward. So as we talk about what lies ahead, there's still a lot of different factors to be considered. And then to the point that you raised, Director Deschel, as well, when you talked about the 300 plus less than 400 participants, we are also leveraging other communication tactics as well when we go out to different engagements by providing information relative to this project as well. So I wanted to frame those comments in reference to the response, and I'm more than happy to yield the floor to Mr. Stoppelkamp if you would like to add any more information. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Deschel, for the question.
Thank you, General Manager. I appreciate that. Yes, I wanted to point out too that milestone 4 hasn't happened yet. And so, you know, we've got milestone 3 is what Director Deschel was addressing there, which he, I think, did the math exactly right. But milestone 4 is an even broader continuing outreach, some of which is effectuated by having this discussion tonight. Mr. Stoppelkamp, sir, would you like to comment at all relative to the question about diesel and expand upon what General Manager CEO Johnson has pointed out, that we're running on somebody else's track right now, assuming we do this?
Yes, thank you very much. And great question. And I think everybody would like to see a battery or overhead catenary on the corridor. We are running on the BNSF railway, which provides some significant challenges with the overhead catenary. The biggest one is the railroads require 23/6 clearance from the top of the rail to the bottom of any obstruction so they can run the double stack through there. And I won't go into all the details, but there's 16 bridges along the corridor that are right at 23/6. So if we want to go overhead catenary, we're going to raise all 16 bridges, plus put the wire out for the whole corridor. Back in 2017, the question was, what can we do at the lowest cost to get service out there? The easiest one, the equipment does exist for diesel. 3 trains in the morning, 3 trains in the afternoon. As we build up, at that point, then we look at, can we go overhead? Can we have a battery operated train? What are the options? But that becomes a very expensive option. So we are looking at how do we keep the price down, provide service immediately, and then expand over time.
Mr. Chair, just one clarifying question, if I may.
Please, sir, go ahead.
So if we were to build it out, have peak service built all the way out, we would effectively just be running diesel or hydrogen or CNG or RNG or whatever item, whatever fuel you'd like to burn. And we would no longer be using the electrified portion of the B line as it exists today. Is that, or do the trains have the ability to switch different fuels?
That's a great question. May I answer that?
Yes, please.
So they would, we'd still run the service out to Westminster all day long on the B line. So that doesn't change. So the trains coming in on whatever power, and it could be hydrogen, it could be battery, it could be diesel, whatever, would then run underneath the catenary. There is equipment that can hop onto the catenary. It's twice as expensive as the regular, but that is an option, and they can drive or operate the equipment under the wire in a Denver Union Station or whatever power unit they're using at that time. So once again, this is to get 3 trains in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, and then expand the service over the next multiple years. And technology will change. We've seen it change over the last 10 years. There is a fleet that will work for what we need to do. And that was the #1 challenge, to make sure we can identify some equipment so there would be an option.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stoppelkamp, and thank you, Director Deschel, for the questions. Let me turn next to our Vice Chair, Eric Davidson, before we recognize Joanne Rusha, Director after Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two comments and just a question. First of all, thank you very much to everybody on staff who's been a part of this. We said at the very beginning that one of the main objectives here was that common set of facts and also engaging with and not on behalf of the community. And I think so far that is going really, really well and has been received very well by the community. And that is thanks to a lot of hard work by many folks at the agency. So thank you for doing that in earnest. I think it makes a big difference when we're looking at something as challenging as this to be communicative and open and collaborative. I also want to thank staff for the public outreach events. I think those two, that was actually a great place to physically see the cooperation for directors or other folks who may not have been there. Each boards were the boards that were presented to the public showing various pieces of information. We're not just staffed by RTD, we're staffed by local staff in the respective cities. I think that's an impressive sign of the collaboration. I will say, I know staff's many steps ahead of me on this and from the conversations that I think there's an opportunity to pick locations that are easier to get to via transit. I had some nice gentlemen come up to me and just express that they don't own cars and it was difficult to come, but they wanted to weigh in on those station locations and understand better. So I simply will say I'll offer, if there's any way at all that I can be helpful in terms of engagement with these communities at the elected official level to help pick locations. I know that's a big challenge as part of the collaboration. Please let me know if I can be helpful. Finally, one just question. I think this is probably to start at least with the general manager and CEO. Great update on the peak service plan. I think we need to focus on our plans and what we're developing and our scenarios. That's great. At the risk of maybe getting us distracted, I just wanted to point out, Ms. Johnson, you referenced being an ex officio member on the Front Range Passenger Rail. Right around the time we decided to proceed with this study, we signed the cooperation agreement and we talked about the opportunities to compare operational models, to share information, and set ourselves up for the potential for partnership discussions in the future. To what extent, if any, and perhaps it's far too premature given where Front Range Passenger Rail is right now, what is currently happening in terms of partnership, engagement, information sharing at this stage of our development of this peak service plan? Thank you.
General Manager, if you have a response for that, please.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Vice Chair Davidson, for the question. So recognizing that we are a little bit ahead of Front Range Passenger Rail, needless to say that we have representation on the work group from Andy Carson, who serves as the general manager of the Front Range Passenger Rail. Needless to say as well, there was a retreat that was held by the Front Range Passenger Rail leadership that included board members, and we've engaged on those fronts. And then more specifically to the point that you raised, we are not yet there in reference to sharing information. They're still developing their service plan and are working with a consultant, but needless to say that as we do this in tandem with the memorandum of understanding that we initiated back in the latter part of 2021, recognizing that we would work in partnership, there's an opportunity as we go forward. The general manager of Front Range Passenger Rail and I are trying to coordinate our schedules so we can have a working discussion about how might that best be served as we proceed forward. So there'll be more information forthcoming, as I think it would be a great idea in the very near future for representation to come from Front Range Passenger Rail to provide you with some understanding of what that cooperation looks like. And the chair and I just spoke of that earlier today as I shared with her that our schedules have yet to align, being my peer at Front Range Passenger Rail. So stay tuned, and conversations have been had not only with Front Range Passenger Rail, but at the state level with special advisors that are working on transportation issues for the state of Colorado and leveraging contacts as relates to garnering additional information. And then last but not least, as you were part of the Northwest commissioners visit to Washington, D.C. For those that aren't familiar, the chair and Director Davidson and I, as well as Michael Davies, took part in that and just engaging with a multitude of different entities, including Amtrak, Federal Railroad Administration, FTA, just to name a few, recognizing that that was a subject matter that came up repeatedly, recognizing my relationships as well to those entities that are being leveraged as we go down this path to help along the Front Range Passenger Rail District. So those are just some high level examples of the partnership that we are embarking upon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, General Manager. Anything further, Mr. Vice Chair?
That answers it. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ms. Johnson. I appreciate the additional comments and look forward to learning more information. And just once again, thanks. This is a really tough project, and the only way to take it is head on and honest about the hard facts. So thanks for doing that. Appreciate it.
That's great. And I think we all look forward to the opportunity at some point of having some direct communication with Front Range Passenger Rail representatives and the board. May I ask at this time, before I go to Director Ruscia, if we can take down the slide presentation? I think we've been sufficiently thanked at this point. And now if I can recognize Director Ruscia for your question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is related to the scope of this study. So I might need a quick refresh. Can someone, and this is for anyone, remind me if the board will also, as part of this feasibility study, get a sense of potential development that might occur if this were to be built out. And I'm not talking about development that already occurred in anticipation of completing fast tracks, but rather what future development, and if that is part of the study, and if so, what, at what point would the board get any more insight into that?
All right, and Mr. Toppelkamp, do you want to lead off the response on that?
Yes, thank you. A great question. For the study, we are really focusing on the 3 trains in the morning, 3 in the afternoon. We are working with the stakeholders for the station locations. These stations were cleared back in 2010. And so the development around these locations, we're really leaving it up to the communities to come back and explain what they would like to see done. At these locations, we do not own the property. We own a couple locations, we own some property, but not necessarily all the property around the station. So we are relying on the communities. We have teamed up with Longmont at the end of line. So we've got the transit center that's going in there and the development. So that's a multi-million-dollar investment for RTD right now. And with that, I see Bill Soroy has shown himself up there. He is, as you know, leads the transit-oriented communities. Can answer a few more on this, but the study is really to identify the corridor, and then we bring all that information back to the board upon completion of the study. Mr. Soroy, would you like to add anything else to that?
Yeah, Mr. Stoppelkamp, I saw Mr. Soroy's face light up the screen, and I thought he might have some further comment. So, Mr. Soroy, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair. And just to note, we and my staff and Jesse Brady and I have had conversations with the consultant team about how they're evaluating development opportunities. I think one of the things that we'll add to this conversation is our experience that we've had over the last 20 plus years in terms of what we've seen in other parts of the area and what we've seen kind of even already along this corridor, and how that may influence any projections that we look at as part of this effort. So we'll adding our own 2 cents into this analysis as well.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that supplemental response. And now let me turn to Chair Geisinger. You have a question for the group.
Actually, just a comment, a couple of comments. I appreciated Director Deschel's question about, the small input, but I do think there's a lot of other input and unless I missed it, it may have been mentioned, but there is an ongoing advisory committee, as I understand it. Is that correct, Patrick? That is all the local governments where their staff and elected officials are weighing in and talking to their constituents as well. So there's this was only one piece of the information that's coming in. I had the opportunity to meet with Andy Carcian yesterday, and I think that they are Front Range Passenger Rail manager, and I think that he and others, the administration, are very much looking forward to working with RTD. He hasn't had the chance, as Deborah said, their schedules are crazy, so they haven't been able to get together. But I think that is the next step for both of them. They will, be looking, as with the land use bill coming up. TOD is top of mind for the administration, and I think therefore for Front Range Passenger Rail. So they will be looking at that as well. I talked to Andy about coming to update the board, and he's excited to do that. So we will have that on deck soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We appreciate your input on that as well and sharing that information with us. Are there other directors, members of the committee or otherwise, who have questions or comments that they wish to make now relative to the Northwest Rail Peak Service feasibility study update? Patrick, Mr. Stanley, let me recognize Director Guzman first as a member of the committee, if I may, and then I'll come back to you, or you may be responding to something that he's going to ask. So Director Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that's done a lot of work on this and all of the involvement you've gotten from the community. I'm excited to be able to help in any way that I can as well. And I'm really engaged with the upcoming meetings. And so I want to push those and make sure that we get involvement. Obviously, everything leaves from Union Station in Denver and heads out that way. And so there's some opportunities there to engage people that are living in Denver, working in Boulder. And I've been in conversation with a few of them. So just keep up the good work. And I'm paying attention, I'm listening, but I just want you to know that I'm here and I hear what's going on. So thank you for this report. It's really impressive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Guzman. We appreciate your participation in this as well. Mr. Stanley, did you have anything to close out with or further comments?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to recognize the efforts of our consultant team. We didn't mention through the presentation, but our HDR consultant team has done a fantastic job with setting us up to get to this point. I didn't want to sit here and take all the credit as staff for the effort that's been done here. So I just wanted to recognize the HDR team. And I want to recognize really all of our SAT members as well. They've really helped the study out. As Director Davidson talked about, they were manning all of their own boards with each one of their communities. And I think it really shows the commitment from the jurisdictions and the stakeholders in the Northwest area to this project as well. So that was all I had.
I appreciate that because it prompts me to mention something else in terms of appreciation. Former RTD Director Judy Lubau was a strong voice and advocate for all of this regarding the Northwest Rail and the feasibility study that we're looking now and addressing peak rail service. And she and I drafted, and then we ultimately had adopted by the board a resolution regarding the same several years ago while she was still on the board. So a lot of people for a long time have put energy into this. All right, Director Guzman, I note that your hand is still up, but that may be out of inertia rather than intention. So I just ask, do you have any further comments, Director Guzman, that you wish to share with us at this time?
No, sorry, I forgot to put my hand down.
That's okay. Thank you very much. All right, nothing else further on this agenda item. Then the next agenda item that we have is the system-wide fare study and equity analysis and the preliminary Title VI analysis materials for public review. And at this time, I would like to welcome back to the microphone Bill Soroy, our Senior Manager of Transit-Oriented Communities, and Chris Quinn, the Planning Project Manager, and once again, Carl Green Jr., our Director of Civil Rights, to present on this item. Mr. Soroy, I think I'll turn it over to you first, sir.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and give me a second while I pull up the presentation so that we can get started here. And okay, is it showing up on everybody's screen?
It is showing up, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much, and we are excited to be here because we are at a major milestone event in terms of going out to the public with our draft recommendations. So we were here tonight to kind of share with you kind of information about the process, and particularly Carl Green Jr., Director of Civil Rights, will be going over the background in Title VI in terms of policies and FTA requirements, and then kind of the preliminary analysis that we've done on the draft recommendations, which again is new and important information to share tonight. We'll also be talking about the upcoming process, which I'm excited to say we're going to be very busy over the next 2 months in terms of going out and getting the information out about these recommendations. We've got a lot of events which I'll talk about, and maybe opportunities for board members, if they so choose, to volunteer to come out and help us out. So with that, what do we want to do tonight? We'll reiterate some of the information that we've obviously shared with you before in terms of the study goals, proposed changes, which we went over in February. And then I'll turn it over to Mr. Green, who will talk about the requirements under Title VI and the various policies, and then ultimately the recommendations. And then lastly, I'll talk about kind of the next steps with regards to the outreach that we're planning on doing, as well as talk a little bit about, we did receive some comments from the board after the February presentation, so I'll just kind of highlight those real briefly and then open it up for any questions. So just to reiterate, I think we've talked about this, every time we've talked with the board and every time we go out to the public, we have 3 primary goals that we've identified. And these are really goals that we've, again, driven by what we've heard from our customers in the community in terms of, our focus on people who rely on us the most and putting equity up front as part of this process. Also looking, we've heard a lot from people about the affordability of our fares, as well as how complicated they are. So we wanted to make sure these goals up front, serve to guide us throughout this process. And I think they've really have done well in doing that in terms of where we're at with the recommendations. So just as a reminder, we presented this information last time in February, but we are going with a recommendation that kind of is a blending of some of the information or some of the alternatives that we discussed in the fall. On the left-hand side of this graphic, you can see the current fare structure, and then on the right, kind of the proposed draft. You can see we're consolidating the local and regional fare categories into a standard fare category, and then keeping an airport fare category, having a greatly reduced monthly pass rate, which again, rewarding those local customers, and then having a single discount in terms of a one price for our discount users, which is a great option for that. Also on the airport side, just a few things to note. We did talk about this in last time as well, where again, we are very focused on the employees at the airport. We've heard a lot about the affordability from the employee perspective. And again, we are focused on that with that monthly pass. And, you can see the dramatic decrease that we are proposing with this proposal. We did keep the base fare, relatively close to what it is. We did reduce it some, but again, that is because of some feedback we did hear through our process that, that those occasional users that do use it think that $10.50 is reasonable. So we're excited about that. Then lastly, if we go to the accessoride fares, you can see we're consistent with how we were approached our other fare categories. We are again, consolidating local and regional, lowering fares some, and the exciting part here is introducing the live discount is an option for those accessoride users. Again, they currently do not have that option, and we are proposing to allow them to have that option in the future. And we don't have any slides on the other programs, which we went over in a fair amount of detail last time, but it is in your packet. So we're happy to answer any information about anything like the Zero Fare for Youth pilot and other things, but those have not changed from what we presented in February. So with that, I am going to turn the mic over to Mr. Carl Green Jr., Director of Civil Rights, to kind of go over the next few slides.
Thank you so much, teammate. So again, as Bill mentioned, my name is Carl Green Jr., Director of the Civil Rights Division, and I'll be going over the FTA requirements as it relates to the fare changes. So first, I just wanted to take a moment and just thinking about, to Bill's point, how excited we are to be being able to deliver this presentation tonight as we think about how far we've came and where we were a year to this date, where this project really started in earnest, April of last year. And what I can say with respect to the FTA requirements, specifically for Title VI, when we think about equity and all of the different checkpoints along the way to ensure that we led with equity, from doing an assessment of the two conceptual alternatives to getting to the point of the final recommended alternative, where tonight it's really about going over a broad stroke overview of the draft Title VI analysis. And based on the requirements as set forth by the Federal Transit Administration, prior to adopting a fare change, RTD must conduct a fare equity analysis and analyze the proposed fare changes. And prior to implementing these changes, the RTD Board of Directors must be made aware and approve of the equity analysis before we move forward. And what I also would like to highlight is the fact that we took a concerted effort to ensure, as we looked at this overall system-wide fare structure changes in past programs, we definitely led with equity. Next slide. So the authority that sets the legal precedent is, again, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And by virtue of the FTA circular, it provides the directives to ensure that transit agencies are upholding the assurances under Title VI. And a key evaluation tool is the fare equity analysis. Next slide. So what this slide here provides is a overview of the decision-making process as it relates to equity analysis, where for fare changes and for major service changes, and specifically as it relates to fare changes, whether it's an increase, a decrease, a change in fare payment, and different other changes, where step one is really about evaluating those changes. And if there are a change to the fares, then we move to step two, which is really about evaluating the possible impacts on minority populations, which we deem as a disparate impact or in accordance with our disparate impact policy. And then we also look at impacts to low-income populations, which is defined at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, which comports with our disproportionate burden policy. And from here on out, you'll probably hear me say Title VI populations or equity populations, but I just wanted to call out that's really signifying minority, BIPOC, and low-income population. And then based off of step two of evaluating these possible impacts, if there are any potential adverse or negative impacts on these populations, we move to looking at evaluating alternatives to either minimize, mitigate, or avoid those impacts. And then we take a concerted effort to change course or address it. Next slide. Whoops, previous slide. So as I mentioned before, the Board of Directors adopted the Title VI policies concurrent with the adoption of the 2022 Title VI program update, which was presented to the board back in June of last year. And these policies are outlined in the board report, but I just wanted to highlight here these policies were in fact adopted by the RTD Board of Directors. Next slide. So at a high level, RTD's determination of a disparate impact or disproportionate burden, which I'll refer to as DI or DB, is based on the difference of impacts experienced by minority and low-income persons as a result of any fare price change or the average of multiple fare changes compared to the impacts experienced by the overall ridership. And the established threshold that we set forth is that the changes shall not be greater than or less than 5% of the impacts absorbed by the overall ridership. And as a spoiler alert on the second point here for the fare change results, it did this by doing this draft analysis and looking at the suite of changes that we're recommending. It did not result in a DI on minority customers, nor a disproportionate burden or DB on low-income customers. Next slide. So just for example's sake, just to walk the board of directors through an average fare analysis example, as I mentioned before, there's a threshold established to evaluate the possible impacts. And as what you can see here, specifically on the disparate impact, you can see that there is a yes. And I just wanted to highlight here, this is just for example or illustrative purposes, is just to make note, if we're looking at the absolute change, percentage change, comparing minority customers versus overall customers, you can see that there was a proposed increase in the average fare by minority customers at 25%, whereas the increase for overall customers is 19%. So doing the math there, just the absolute percent change, it's 6%. So it exceeds that 5% threshold, which could indicate there's a potential impact that they're receiving more of the fare increase. Whereas we look at the image on the far right for disproportionate burden, it's a no, where we can compare the difference for our low income is 22% compared to the overall customers is 19%. So the delta between those two is 3%, which is well below that 5% threshold. So just for the purpose of this example, I just wanted to walk y'all through of there's a lot of technical analyses involved in this, but this is just a educational reference of how we conduct the analysis. Next slide. So just to give y'all an overview of the methodology. So a fare equity analysis compares the current to the proposed fare, and again, here we calculate the absolute as well as the percent change. And the average fare analysis is utilized to assess the effects of the proposed fare changes on the average fare paid per boarding by minority or low-income customers compared to overall customers. And what is used in the average fare analysis, or the AFA, is survey data, specifically our customer satisfaction survey, to garner data on transfer and fare product usage rates, as well as customer demographics, while ticket sales and revenue data captures ridership by fare payment type. So utilizing the DI and DB threshold, a determination is made whether the fare change would result in adverse impacts on these populations, whether it's minority or low income. And more or less, this average fare analysis allows us to be able to better understand what are the nature of impacts to these populations. Next slide. So now I'll be getting into the draft analysis of the proposed fare changes. And specifically, I wanted to highlight for the draft fare equity analysis that was conducted, it includes the fare restructuring. So specifically the elimination of all regional fare products and the acceptance of local fare products on regional services, as well as the price reduction, the introduction of fare capping, the expansion of eligibility for RTD's low-income fare discount program. And as a reminder, the intent of this analysis is again to prevent inequitable changes from being implemented. And I also wanted to mention that although fare changes to accessorized services in the Transit Assistance Grant Program, the Semester Pass, and other programs weren't necessarily included, it does overall, when we think about the equity component, it does complement the overall draft recommendation and is truly centered on equity populations. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, the spoiler alert as far as the results. So specifically looking at the DI impacts, comparing minority versus overall customers, you can see that there's a 25% decrease in the average fare compared to minority customers, who experience a 23% decrease in the average fare. And specifically what I wanted y'all to really take a look at as far as the graph or the table here is looking at the proposed average fare, where it's $1.05 for overall customers compared to 97 cents for the proposed average fare for minority customers. And doing the math there, the absolute percentage change, it's only 2.3%, which is below that 5% threshold. So the end result, there's no disparate impact on minority customers. Next slide. So similar to the previous one, just really getting into it, looking at the proposed average fare and looking at the percent or the overall change in average fare is minus 25.4% compared to the minus 22%, where the delta between those is 3.4%. So again, here it's below that 5% disproportionate burden threshold, so there is no impact on low-income customers. Next slide. So the draft fare equity analysis findings. So the analysis did not identify any burdens on minority or low-income customers. However, it did help identify targeted areas for further improvement. One specifically is expanded access to MyRide retail opportunities. So as we think about fare capping and folks being able to really benefit from this, is having an expanded retail network so they can load value onto their cards and utilize it as a point of sale to be able to take advantage of the fare capping. The second one is increased outreach activities to promote the LIVE program, and which includes partnerships with community partners. Specifically, I wanted to highlight that we just completed today was our 2024 to 2026 draft communications and outreach program. We heard a lot from our customers that there is a lack of awareness and there's a need for more education as it relates to this program. So we put together a document with support from finance, market development, our transit equity office, and also our communications team to build out a plan that we could then put out to the community for their feedback on what additional efforts or improvements can we make to this overall plan to make sure that we lead with ensuring that we're promoting access to our LIVE program and the expansiveness that we're moving forward with. So second bullet point, the average fare paid by minority and low-income customers remains lower than the system-wide average fare. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. If you look at the system-wide average fare, the minority and low-income customers ultimately pay lower than that average fare. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight for Title VI populations across all fare types experience a decrease in the average fare, except for low-income customers in the Neighborhood Eco-Pass program. So one thing I'll highlight before I pass it over to Bill is just thinking about the average fare analysis for low-income NECO customers. They are anticipated to benefit less than the overall population. However, it's important to remember that all utilization across all customer segments or populations, whether that be minority, non-minority, low income and non-low income, it's aggregated together when we think about the overall customer. So overall, if you think about the households in the same neighborhood, they're paying the identical amount. So this denotes that low income customers are not inherently, and a verbiage that we tend to use is better off or worse off. But for this particular point, I just wanted to mention that low income customers are not inherently worse off with the result of this analysis. With that being said, I'll now pass it back over to Bill Savoy.
Thank you, Carl. Now I'll just talk a little bit about that public outreach engagement, just starting off and just in terms of the efforts that we've done to date and really focusing and being a customer and community driven process. We have really done some things throughout this effort that have kind of been unprecedented of the agency in terms of focusing things on working with our community-based organizations and expanding our outreach that way, focusing on our language access, focusing on a lot of things, again, trying to hit some of those disadvantaged populations and underrepresented populations. And I think the other piece to this is that we have also used our traditional partners in terms of our jurisdictional staff, our people that are involved with our past programs and some of our people that do represent our equity populations to really help us take some of the feedback that we have gotten throughout this process to help mold that into the recommendations that we do have. And they did really help us kind of in that process and through those meetings that we had with them throughout the study. I think they're a great benefit, and we look forward to this as being a potential model for the future efforts. So just a reminder in terms of the outreach that we've done thus far. Like Carl said, we started back in April and focused initially on getting feedback on the current system using a variety of means, of some of which I just identified. And in addition to that, doing an online survey, again, got good results from that. Then over the summer, we were focusing on conceptual fare options. And then in the fall, we did focus on some detailed alternatives for consideration. And I think we went over that in a great amount of detail the last time we talked to you in February. And again, very, very extensive outreach effort on that one in terms of the online survey and all the other efforts, all the other types of techniques that we utilized. So in terms of where we're going, some of the next steps, I'm excited to talk about this. I mean, we're going to be releasing this for public comment later this month. The exciting piece of news is we are going to have a press release later this week, which is going to kind of start the public engagement process. We will be launching our new website, or a refined website, I should say, to speak, that will give people a lot of information to provide their input to the recommended alternatives. So that look for that later this week. Also, some news in terms of even updating this slide, and these are moved around a little bit. We do have actually 6 public hearings identified. There's going to be 4 virtual hearings, and these dates are slightly off as we updated them last week. So we're going to meeting on the 2nd and 3rd, and the meeting on the 2nd will be in Spanish. And then we'll have 2 meetings on the 16th, both kind of at we'll say a little bit odd times in the morning and at lunchtime. One of those will be in Spanish. And then we will be having in-person public hearings, the first time for this process to have in-person public hearings. So we've got 2 of those on May 11th and May 17th. And those will be kind of central locations. One will be at the Alliance Center, which is just a few blocks from our offices at Blake Street. And the other will be at the Carla Madison Rec Center there along Colfax near York. So we're excited about those. And those are, some of our traditional outreach tools with the public hearings. We'll be doing presentations and getting feedback throughout that process. We have a variety of other events, and I'm excited to talk about the pop-up events. We have, I believe, 18 to 20 events identified that are going to be happening throughout to the end of April and on through the first 3 weeks of May. We will be going out to festivals and cultural events and having booths available to provide information to people. We will be at events like Cinco de Mayo, and I think it's good. I may be getting this wrong. Viva the Streets, which is a new event, and a few other events throughout the metro area. And again, we're being very purposeful in trying to have good geographic coverage in these events. In addition to that, we will be going to several stations and stops along our bus and rail network. And we will be going, trying to identify, be there during commuting times to get our customers and intercept them as they're waiting for their train or bus to hopefully get some of their input and feedback and direct them to the website. And this is going to be a great opportunity. If board members are interested in coming out to us at early in the morning or on a Saturday, you certainly will have the opportunity. We're going to be sharing this information with the board office, and we will have a potential sign up for any board members who are interested. Like I said, we're going to be having events throughout to the end of month through the end of April and throughout most of the month of May. I mentioned the website, which is going to be launching at the end of the week. We do have, like Carl mentioned earlier, we do have working with our community-based organizations, and we've been giving them up to speed on the information that we want them to share with their communities that they serve. They will also be helping us to recruit for people to come to our public hearings. So we're using them for that as well. We also are working with some of our other community partners and working with Michael Davies, our government relations officer, and his folks at Catalyst to help identify opportunities for us to go and talk to some of the stakeholders. We currently have a couple of opportunities identified. I think we're speaking to one of the Denver City Council Committee, as well as the Aurora City Council later in May. And we have opportunities. And then there's opportunities here for board members as you are out and talking with the groups that you speak to on a regular basis. We have information that we can provide you in terms of speaking points, slides, or other things that we can provide to help you disseminate some of this information, and again, directing people to the website to getting a good feedback as we go through this process. We are finally, but not last but not least, we do have a series of opportunities that we're talking to our own staff through our normal facts and snacks and other options that we're going to be doing. So we'll be doing that as well. The last thing I wanted to cover just before we open it up for questions is we did receive comments and questions from board members after our last presentation. We did include those in the packet along with our responses to some of the questions and comments. So please note that, again, none of the comments that we received, we felt materially affected things in terms of, putting us on a new course in terms of the alternatives. So we are, again, focusing on moving forward with what we presented in February and again today in terms of the recommendations for moving forward with this study. So with that, I will open it up for questions and I will turn off the screen share since we saw enough of the thank you slide the last time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mr. Siroy. We now invite directors, members of the committee or otherwise to raise questions or offer comments relative to the presentation that we have received. We will begin with Director Broom. Director Broom, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. One of the routes that's going to get the most benefit from these proposed changes is going to be the airport or the A-line. Is there going to be any special effort to get that information out to the people that use the A-line or who work at the businesses along the A-line? For example, putting some flyers on the trains? Thanks.
Chair, if I may.
Thank you. Yes, if you may, Mr. Siroy, please.
Yes, and we have been working very closely with a group of stakeholders at the airport that represent concessionaires and other businesses and the unions at the airport. And we're actually having a meeting with them at the end of the month to go over the recommendations. And they did have a fair amount of influence on the recommendations themselves. We did have some meetings with them earlier in the process. We also do have some events scheduled along the A-line, I believe, and that we'll be providing input to or information to our customers through that vehicle as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Director Broom. Vice Chair Davidson, you are recognized at this time, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just can't hold back. This is awesome. I hope the team is having fun with this. This is really, really, really great, really encouraging, really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. And Director Rusha, you are recognized, please, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. So I actually had a follow-up to my question that was somewhat addressed in the packet. Would this be the appropriate time to ask it?
Yes, Director, this is.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the question I had asked was about Access-a-Ride. So before the board, I believe will be a proposal to include Access-a-Ride into the low-income fares, which I am very excited about. And excluding Access-a-Ride users might be an ADA violation. So it's good that we are correcting this. But my concern was that if we do this, it looks like we will have to wait until January 1st of next year when the other changes go into the effect, assuming the board votes for them. And so the response I got from staff was that OIT had said it would take about 8 months to implement changes through its peak system. My question is, did we specifically reach out to OIT and ask about including Access-a-Ride, understanding that might actually be a different timeline, particularly considering that many of our paratransit users are already peak members?
And I think Mr. Siroy is prepared with an answer to that question.
Well, I might choose a lifeline. I'm going to see if I can I might defer that for a second because I know that Monica Triple-Harnke, who's on at the meeting, I know is the best person to answer that question. So I will, if you give me a second, hopefully I'll get an answer from her, and before we're done, I will hopefully give. If not, I will follow up after the meeting with an answer to that question specifically.
And I will point out, Mr. Soroy, that in any event, my understanding is that we are not talking about implementing all of the changes as of the time that we adopt it, but rather that everything would roll in as of January 1 or sometime in the first quarter, so that changes that impact the discounts, the LIVE program, persons with disabilities, Medicaid, and the age advantaged population, the 65 and overs, would all go in together. But I wonder if General Manager CEO Johnson wants to opine on that, in case I may have misspoken too. So General Manager, you are recognized.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. And I did just want to qualify that we are looking at the pilot program for youth fairs and recognizing when the academic school year starts. We would be at a disadvantage talking about January, but that will be up for the board to decide as we go forward. So I just wanted to qualify that as well. And then as we talked about, Director Arusha made a comment saying that we could have been violating the American with Disabilities Act, recognizing the mandated American with Disabilities Act as it relates to fare requires that we provide half of the fare that goes forward. So there was no violation of the ADA relative to what our fare structure has specified. And I see Mr. Green is nodding as well. But I just wanted to clarify that for the record, if anyone's left with the impression that we were in violation of the American with Disabilities Act of 1990, because this organization was not pursuant to the fares. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Director Arusha, did you want to comment further?
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, what is or isn't legal sometimes is just what's litigated. And I think there are enough lawyers here to know that. But also what is legal is not necessarily what is just. MTA is actually being sued for this very thing. And there is some FTA guidance regarding universal discounts and when they would apply to paratransit. But I also do want to recognize that that our GM CEO is in favor of including Access-a-Ride into the low-income fares discount. And so I also just want to state for the record that I truly appreciate that and her leadership. That's incredibly important to the community, and I think for this board to recognize as well. And those are all the comments I have, and I appreciate all the staff's work on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. Mr. Soroy, your hand is up now, so maybe you want to finish out on this particular topic.
Yes, thank you, Chair Tisdale. I did get my lifeline from Ms. Treple-Harnke. So she did say that we have not reached out to the state yet, but I think that in answering the question that you initially wrote, Director Arusha, I think the point was it's a long lead time with the state in order to get the programming into the peak system. So we are going to be working with that diligently over the course of the next few months to get that in and to work with them so that we can implement that as soon as possible.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your supplemental information there. Director Deschel, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you. I just want to take a moment to express gratitude to General Manager CEO Bill Soroy and the entire team who's been working on this. For those of you who've been on the board, kids and their ability to get to school or wherever they choose to go is really critical. And your willingness to put a number out there, which I think is an attainable number, to look at starting with the actual school year as opposed to the calendar year. It really is great. Looking forward to working with the partnership to be able to secure and identify that funding on a more sustainable basis. And just really great to see that we are making policies that fit and align with the communities we're serving and the sub-portion of those communities we're serving. So thank you all.
Thank you. Those are good comments and observations to be shared with all. I appreciate that. I will note one thing that stands out in my mind about all of this is that our discount fare, as we are proposing it, is for what I call the age advantaged community, that's 65 plus, as well as the Medicare population, as well as people with disabilities, and our LIVE customers. And that we have now proposed increasing the availability of that LIVE discount significantly to get even more people who can qualify for that. You should note that the age advantage population, those 65 and older, that represents about 34% of the population of the Regional Transportation District. I refer you back to packet page 42 and the CU Leads presentation that we had. So the discount eligible population consists of those age advantage folks, plus the other groups that I've mentioned, Medicare, people with disabilities, and the increased eligible for the LIVE program. You know, pretty soon we're within striking distance of 50% of the district's population that will enjoy these discounts. And it does warrant repeating that we take a current, for example, airport fare of $5.25. And for this group that I've just described, we reduce it to $1.35. That's pretty significant. And then the monthly pass for this group, the discounted travelers, goes from approximately $100 to $27. So I think this is something about which we should brag a lot and share with people. And I think that among other populations that we can communicate with in the CBOs, we can talk to our chambers of commerce and let them know so that they can spread that word as well. Are there others who have comments, perhaps based upon anything that I've said, who would like to chime in at this time? If not, then Mr. Siroy, do you have any words of a wrap up, or does this conclude your presentation relative to the fair equity analysis that we've discussed?
I see our general manager's hands raised, so I will defer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that. Thank you very much. Sharp eyes. I appreciate younger eyes. All right, General Manager, CEO Johnson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to publicly recognize the members of this team. When we had discussions, recognizing when I first came into the organization and I talked about the opportunities, this team leaned into the moment. They had creative suggestions. I also want to specifically commend Carl in reference to his experience and expertise in the equity realm, due to the fact that previously we did not have that level of expertise relative to fair studies and equity analyses, and recognizing that he was able to leverage his experience garnered from a different transit agency and bring it full forward, especially leveraging the extensive outreach with community-based organizations. I think that's made a difference. And I am extremely proud to be a member of their team, and I wanted to publicly acknowledge that. So kudos all around. And there's been others like Monica, there's other people, and I don't want to be remiss in not acknowledging them as well. But, you know, talking about what we can do and ensuring that they knew that they were supported. This clearly is an example of what we can do when we come together as one RTD. So thank you very kindly, team.
Thank you. I appreciate your sharing those words of commendation to all. They are well deserved. One thing I know, where there was in the board packet at page 164 of the board packet, an outline of timeline next steps that differs a little bit from the presentation we received. And one of the things that is identified is board authorization to release proposed fare structure draft fair equity analysis. For all practical purposes, we've done that by discussing it tonight, of course. But this is not here as an action item, but rather as an information item. I do suggest, however, to the extent that staff would like this, and I'll look to Mr. Siroy, that the board would be in a position, the committee would be in a position at this time to give a head nod to go forward, and that the full board could ratify that head nod to proceed with the release of all such information to the public. So, Mr. Siroy, do you have a thought on that, sir?
You know, Chair, I think it's fully up to you all if you want to do that. And I see General Manager Johnson has her hand up. She may have a comment on this as well.
All right, thank you very much, General Manager, CEO Johnson.
Yes, thank you so much, sir, for the opportunity to opine. So for all intents and purposes, as it relates to the information we've been providing, this really was to apprise you all as we release it to the public, recognizing that we need to garner feedback from them and then bring forward back something for your action for all intents and purposes. So as we talked about that really, and I'll assume responsibility, I think the word was used inappropriately, but we wanted to ensure that you all knew what was going to the public coming full circle. So thank you very much.
All right, well, I appreciate that. And then, as I say, in any event, because it's been appended to our materials for this meeting, it certainly does constitute a release of such information to the public. And we all want to champion and celebrate this proposal as much as possible to get buy-in. It would be nice to get some good press on something as good as this. Just a thought. All right, are there any other comments relative to this item before I move on to other matters? Seeing none, we are now at the next portion of our agenda, which is other matters, and that leaves us an opportunity to discuss matters that have not been included on the agenda this evening, but should properly be brought before the Finance and Planning Committee. And it's my distinct pleasure to recognize at this time our Vice Chair, Eric Davidson. Mr. Vice Chair, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we're getting a little late, so I'll try to keep this brief. I just wanted to take a moment to recap some of the discussion that occurred recently at the board retreat as it relates to potential financial policy and focus. Recognizing we had General Counsel Snyder and CEO and General Manager Johnson there, but not our finance team. So for Mr. McLeod and his team, I just wanted to do, and for committee members here as a reminder, some of the takeaways we had from the retreat. And then I think as the year unfolds, we can start to tackle some of these items as discussion items or those that lend themselves to this. At the board retreat, we discussed a high priority for the board to what we called create a long-term and resilient funding model for RTD. This has already come up this evening. The idea of looking at some potential alternative funding models. We brainstormed some ideas of what might come out of this. Ultimately, what I would like to see or would encourage committee members and the board to do is to identify specific policies we can make at a very high level to enable staff to really get creative and think of some ideas, and then ultimately board and staff to partner together for whatever needs to be done to revisit this model. So some of the specific bullet points we talked about, I'll just go through them very quickly. And to finance staff, I'll certainly make myself available to talk through some of these. Some of these may not be relevant or helpful. Some might be missing. I just would like to express that desire to really partner on this. One bullet we talked about was potentially benchmarking our funding model against our true peers in terms of transit agencies. Perhaps this has been done before and we may have some models and may have some internal knowledge about this. But having some benchmark and making those available would help us communicate, I think, to our public and potential private partners, especially and notably the state, in terms of where our funding model rests as compared to peer agencies. Another bullet we discussed was to review previous and or existing RTD reports on the matter of revenue diversification. I'm familiar with at least one such report that has been done in recent years of looking at opportunities to diversify revenue. It's probably worth dusting those off and making sure we're all familiar. We also had a bullet where we just said we need to brainstorm and research potential alternative sources of funding. This can include things like fees, public funding sources, cities and counties, the state, school districts, as we're talking about the youth fair number, and thank you, Director Deschel, for calling out the willingness of staff to put forward a number on that. I also greatly appreciate that. Private funding source opportunities being arts organizations, sports organizations, ticket vendors, foundational funding, other advertising opportunities should they exist on digital medium, and out-of-the-box thinking. So we just had a discussion around, we don't know, but it would be nice to set some policy and really enable staff to think through this and present some ideas. Related to those was also making sure that we garner a full understanding of the extent of our jurisdiction as a special district in terms of what we can and cannot do in terms of levying fees. Another bullet we discussed was considering opportunities to strengthen our mid and long-term financial position, leveraging any creative ideas that the finance team might have. This is where I think, many kudos to our team last year for identifying tremendous opportunities for refinance. I understand there may be some more creative opportunities, and I think what I was hearing at the board retreat is that this board is very open to supporting creative opportunities to ensure that our finances are sound for years to come. Finally, we did have some discussion around Tabor, and we discussed that there were really two major things here. One was that this board does at some point need to take formal action on a position on Tabor and how RTD would like to proceed. I think the term debrucing has been brought up a number of times, but the board hasn't taken a formal position. So the need to do so is one thing that came up. And furthermore, the need to formally create research and put forward to the board the feasibility of various Tabor impact mitigation strategies, which of course could include debrucing, but also might include other solutions to chip away at this. Enterprise funds have been discussed, extending the exemption via a refinance of some of our bonds has been discussed. Any of these ideas we had brought up. I did have a chance to confer with ad hoc committee member on the Tabor committee, Director Ruscia. I have not had a chance to do so with Director Broom. I'll open up the floor if either of them would like to make a comment about the potential idea that the Tabor ad hoc committee could engage with staff on these Tabor specific items and come forward to the Finance and Planning Committee in order to bring forward what could become recommended actions that could come through Finance and Planning to the board, such as a formal position on Tabor. Finally, we just expressed our interest as a board to be able to collaborate with government relations and our general manager on anything that we can be helpful on pursuing any type of opportunities in these areas. So I realize it was a lot of bullets. Again, I'll make myself available to staff and ultimately what I'd encourage this committee to do, and I will help lead this effort, is to develop some specific policies at that high level that can be used to identify these opportunities and take advantage of them as we plan for our financial future. So thank you. I'm happy to field any questions that staff may have. I think, Chair, you had a suggestion, which was a great one, that directors could potentially submit comments in writing. And then also, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, to our ad hoc Tabor committee members, if there's any comments they'd like to make, please do so. But thank you for the time. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And I'm going to call upon Director Ruscia first, if she has a comment, and Director Broom, if Director Broom would like to weigh on this as well. I will note one thing that we discussed that I didn't hear in your enumeration there that I want to make sure we keep sight of, and that is to take advantage of the opportunities that the legislature accorded us when they amended the RTD Act so as to allow for other development at transit-oriented development sites at our stations and lifting some of the restrictions on us relative to that, and parking, because those are streams of revenue that are very valuable and need to be a part of the discussion. Having said that, let me turn first to Director Ruscia, because I see that she is unmuted. And would you like to add something now, Director Ruscia?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think that Director Davidson captured our conversation accurately. And I would just add or emphasize that I believe that there is a great opportunity for the ad hoc committee to collaborate with this committee. And there's a lot of work to be done. It is also at the purview of our chair of the board, Chair Geisinger. So I don't want to overstep or cruise in her lane. But I did like the idea that perhaps we do a little bit more work, get some updated data, and bring it back to this committee so that this committee can take that into consideration with other projections and ideas.
We appreciate that. That's great. And let me ask Director Broom of the Tabor Committee if he has anything to add here. Director Broom and I are probably the only people who actually knew Horace Tabor back in the day. We're old enough. So Director Broom, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Just to reiterate that it's important that the board discuss this issue, determine if the board is willing to mess with Tabor. And so it'd be foolish to go through a big, long study and come up with recommendations if the board is, adamant that they don't want to stir up the water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And Chair Geisinger, your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. Just to reassure that no one's in my lane, but thank you for raising that. I really appreciate. I'll start with Eric, with Second Vice Chair Davidson. That moving this forward. One of the things I think we're all committed to is moving forward the policies that we discussed and the actions that came out of the retreat. And I've been working on that some. We'll be talking to various others of you. But I do think that moving forward with the Tabor Ad Hoc Committee at this point to start to bring some information together and back to this committee. And one thing we want to do, and I think General Counsel would probably be very helpful in this, and Mr. McLeod too, is get everybody up to speed on what the issue is and what it could mean for RTD. So I think that would be a next step. But let's get the ad hoc committee together again, and may make sense to add another person or two to it, so we have more of a committee and move it forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I think a Tabor tutorial would be appreciated by a number of the directors who have not had to have any interaction with that before, or with debrucing, as those of us who have been in municipal government have had to deal with from time to time over the years. Are there any other comments on this topic relative to income diversification and expansion that Director Davidson brought forward tonight based upon what we discussed at the retreat? Seeing no hands and hearing no outbursts, I think we've concluded that discussion for this evening. Let me ask now, are there any other matters that any director, member of the committee or otherwise, would like to bring forward for the Finance and Planning Committee to address at this time? He paused for a moment and moved on. All right, no one has suggested anything further, so that concludes the other matters portion of our agenda. I will note for the sake of the record that our next Finance and Planning Committee meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, May the 9th at 5:30 p.m. That meeting also, as I indicated earlier at the top of the meeting, will be conducted virtually. We hope soon to be back in person for the committee meetings, but that meeting will be virtual on Tuesday, May 9 at 5:30 p.m. And seeing no other discussion before this committee at this time, then this meeting of the Finance and Planning Committee of Tuesday, April 11, stands adjourned at 8:07 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you all very much. Have a most pleasant evening.
Thank you.